They told me the station was decommissioned. That's the word they used. Decommissioned. Like it was a piece of equipment that had simply run its service life and could be quietly shelved. Like I was equipment too. I stayed anyway. That was 3 years before the sky changed. 3 years of silence, of red dust on the solar panels, of the shortwave cracking in the corner of the room, the way Marta used to crack her knuckles before bed. 3 years of keeping the transmitter warm and the logs running even though command had stopped reading them, of performing the maintenance routines I had always performed, the daily instrument checks, the hull integrity scans, the careful cleaning of the optical array lenses, because routine is the only thing that keeps a man sane when the universe has decided to stop paying attention to him. Nobody told me to leave. Nobody told me to stay. Nobody said much of anything once the resupply ships stopped coming and the relay network got rerouted through the new stations closer to the core worlds. Relay Station Cordisburgo sat at the outer edge of what the charts called the frontier buffer zone, which was a bureaucratic way of saying the back end of nowhere. And the back end of nowhere is where I had always ended up, one posting at a time, for 31 years. The frontier buffer was a band of space roughly 200 light-years deep, running along the edge of human-explored territory, studded with relay stations and small outposts, and the occasional survey camp. The whole apparatus designed to extend the reach of human communications and to serve as an early warning network for anything coming from outside explored space. Most of it, by the time I got to Cordisburgo, had been superseded. Better technology, closer to home. The frontier buffer was still there on the charts, but it had stopped being a priority, and the stations along its edge had started going dark one by one as their crews were reassigned, and their budgets were quietly absorbed by other programs. Cordisburgo went dark on a Tuesday. The official notice came via Typebeam with the routine morning traffic, tucked between a supply manifest update and a new set of navigational advisories, as if decommissioning a station that 2 people had lived on for 7 years was the same order of significance as updating the approach corridor beacons. Relay Station CORDISBURGO, hereby DCOMMSSINED, as of STRDATE 7743.2. Crew to stand by for extraction SCHEDULING. All non-essential systems to be PLACED in standby mode. Long-range transmitter to remain active for emergency use only. I read it twice. Then I put the notice in the log file where it belonged and went back to fixing the seal on the secondary airlock, which had been leaking for a week, and didn't care about the administrative status of the station. Marta used to say I was running towards something, not away. I never corrected her. She died in the 2nd year after the station went dark, not from anything dramatic. Her heart simply stopped one night while she slept, and I woke in the morning to find her already cold, the covers still pulled up to her chin, her face with the relaxed expression of someone who had decided, without consulting anyone, that she was done. The rock station was playing in the main bay. An old song, the kind with a guitar solo that sounded like argument and loss in equal measure. I turned it off, then turned it back on because the silence was worse. I kept her in the medical bay for 2 days while I figured out what to do. There is a protocol for death in deep space postings. I had read it. I had never expected to use it. The protocol involves notifying command, filing a death report, and arranging for the remains to be collected by the next scheduled transport. The next scheduled transport to a decommissioned station was not coming. I sent the notification to command anyway. I got back an automated acknowledgement and 3 days later, a form message expressing condolences and noting that given the decommissioned status of the facility, collection of remains would need to be coordinated with the nearest active station, Relay Post 14 South, approximately 4 light months away, and that they would be in touch. They were not in touch. I gave Marta the best funeral I could manage, which was not much. I said some words into the log recorder because that felt more permanent than saying them to the walls. I read her the passage from Gimmerie's Rosa that she had liked, the one about the land of the interior being not a place but a state of the soul. She had been from Minas Gerais originally, from a small town in the hills, and she had always said that the frontier felt like home to her, the endless open space, the silence between stars. I had never quite understood that when she was alive. I understood it better after. I left her chair where it was, in the corner of the main bay by the porthole. I did not move her things. I kept the rock station playing. I filed my maintenance logs and my routine reports and my daily instrument checks the same as I always had, and I addressed them to command, and I sent them into the tight beam link knowing that nobody was reading them, and I kept doing that because stopping would have meant admitting that none of it mattered, and I was not ready to admit that. I talked to command once in the months after. A duty officer whose name I never got, his identifier was a serial number, the way junior staff on overnight rotations are identified when the system expects that nobody will need to remember who they were. I told him Marta was gone and I was filing to continue the posting. He said the posting no longer existed. I said I was aware of that. He asked if I needed evacuation transport. I said no. He said the paperwork would require me to sign off on liability. I said fine. He said I should understand that no further supplies would be dispatched to a decommissioned facility. I said I understood. He said I should understand that in the event of an emergency, response time to my coordinates would be measured in weeks at minimum. I said I have been at these coordinates for 7 years. I understand the geometry. He said, "Sir, I'm required to advise you that this decision is not recommended." I said, "Noted." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Is there someone I can contact for you, family?" I thought about that, then I said no thank you. He signed off. He did not call again, neither did anyone else. So there I was, 64 years old, widower, last human being within 2.5 light hours in any direction, running a transmitter that nobody was listening to, keeping logs that nobody was reading, eating ration packs that had another 8 years before they expired and should have lasted me just fine if I was careful. The rock station played its songs 4 minutes late, 4 minutes, the travel time for the signal from the nearest inhabited world, a gap you stopped noticing after a while. You just accepted that everything you heard had already happened by the time it reached you, and you stopped thinking of that as loss and started thinking of it as the normal condition of living at the edge of things. I thought that was how it would end. Quiet, slow, me and the shortwave and the red dust in Marta's chair in the corner that I never moved. I was wrong. The first sign was the interference. It started 6 months before I saw anything. Static bleeding into the rock station at irregular intervals, not cleanly but in the way that a voice bleeds through a wall, enough to register, not enough to understand. Not the kind of static you get from solar weather or equipment degradation. I knew both of those well. Solar interference comes in waves correlated to the local star's activity cycle, a rhythm you learn by living with it. Equipment degradation produces consistent patterns in specific frequency bands, and it worsens predictably as components age. This was neither. It came and went without correlation to anything I could identify. It had a quality I kept trying to name and kept failing to name, a sense of deliberateness. The way a knock on a door has deliberateness even before you've decided whether to open it. I logged it, I adjusted the receiver, I ran diagnostics. Nothing was wrong with the equipment, the interference kept coming. I started recording it. Old habit from the early years of the posting, you log what you cannot explain and you let someone smarter figure it out later. There was nobody smarter available, but I recorded it anyway. 64 hours of interference over 3 months. I played it back at different speeds. I ran it through the harmonic analyzer that we used to use for sensor sweeps, a piece of equipment I had kept operational mainly because it took maintenance time I needed, and also because I had never liked things going unused. Nothing resolved into language or mathematics, or anything I had a framework for. What I did notice, after several weeks of patient comparison, was this. The interference always came from the same bearing, 7 degrees off stellar north, slightly below the ecliptic plane. Always. Not approximately, exactly, within the margin of error of my instruments, which I had calibrated personally and trusted. Like something sitting out there at a fixed point and humming to itself, and not particularly caring whether I heard. I swung the long-range passive array to that bearing and left it there. What I saw over the following weeks was, at first, nothing. Then the instruments showed something. A mass reading, faint enough that I spent 4 days attributing it to sensor error before I accepted what the calibration data was telling me. The sensor was fine and there was something there. Not a rock, the spectral signature was wrong. Not a comet or any natural body in the catalog. The signature was wrong in a way I could not dismiss or explain, and the mass was consistent across 10 days of passive readings, which ruled out most natural phenomena. It was not moving. It was simply present, at a distance I calculated as roughly 800,000 kilometers off my port flank, and it had been present. I went back through the archive data for at least 4 months. 4 months. It had arrived, or assembled, or become visible to my instruments, several weeks before the interference started. I filed a report in my log. I addressed it to command. I gave it a formal incident number. I wrote the report in the careful, measured language I had always used for anomaly reports, stating what I had observed and what I could not determine and what further data I was collecting. I did not write what I actually thought, which was that there was something out there in the dark, and it had been there for 4 months and it was making sounds. What I did, instead of sleeping that night, was sit in the main bay with a cup of coffee and the rock station playing, and let myself think about the thing I had been not thinking about since the readings confirmed. 800,000 kilometers is close, in deep space terms. It is roughly twice the distance between my home world and its moon. It is well within what any civilization capable of interstellar travel could cover in hours. Whatever was out there had chosen to stay at that distance. It had chosen, or whatever it did instead of choosing, to stay put and emit interference, and not come any closer and not go away. That is what I kept returning to. It had not come any closer. Something capable of crossing whatever distance it had crossed to get here had parked itself at 800,000 kilometers and stayed there, for months, making sounds that registered on a decommissioned station's instruments without apparently doing anything else. It was not powering up. My threat assessment instruments, such as they were, showed nothing I could classify as weapons readiness. It was sitting, waiting. Listening, maybe, to the same thing I was listening to. The rock station, playing its songs 4 minutes late in the dark. I decided, after a second cup of coffee, that I was not afraid. There was something freeing about that realization. I had been widowed for over a year, alone for 3 years before that in any meaningful sense, stationed at the edge of nowhere with nothing to lose and nowhere in particular to be. Fear requires the prospect of loss. I had worked through most of the obvious losses already. I thought about Marta. She would have said something dry and sensible. She would have looked at the readings and looked at me and said, "Well, what are you going to do about it, Osorio?" That was the question. In the morning, I tuned the transmitter to the frequency of the interference. I broadcast Marta's favorite song. An old one, classic rock. A song she had played enough times that I knew every note of it. The kind with a guitar solo that sounds like it's arguing with the universe and losing beautifully. Then arguing again and losing more beautifully. Then somehow arriving at something that isn't quite triumph and isn't quite acceptance, but is truer than either. I broadcast it at full power in a tight beam, 7 degrees off stellar north, slightly below the ecliptic, pointed directly at the thing I could not see. Then I sat down and drank my coffee and waited. 11 hours later, the interference changed. Not subtly. The pattern shifted in a way that my instruments flagged before I had consciously registered it, the rhythm altering, the frequency modulation moving in a new configuration that my harmonic analyzer, after 47 seconds of sustained output, classified as a coherent signal. I could not decode it. I ran it through every analysis protocol I had and it came back unknown on all counts. But it came back coherent, structured. The randomness was gone from it. What was coming back at me had been processed by something and returned with intention. I had sent a song, something had heard it and answered. I sat in the main bay for a long time after that. Outside the porthole, the star field looked exactly as it always did, indifferent, ancient, vast, saying nothing. But somewhere in that dark, 800,000 kilometers away, something was doing what I was doing. Sitting with whatever it had for a receiver, in whatever it had for a room, listening to the signal and deciding what to send back. I broadcast another song, slower this time, something with space in it, the way the old blues records have space in them, room between the notes where you can hear the silence being shaped into something. The response came in 6 hours, longer this time, more complex. I recorded everything. Over the following weeks, I established a pattern. I broadcast in the mornings, morning by my ship's clock, which had no relationship to anything external but gave the days a structure I needed. I broadcast 1 or 2 songs, sometimes with my own voice talking over them, explaining what I was doing, which I knew was absurd, and did anyway because the alternative was silence. The responses came at irregular intervals, never on a schedule I could predict, and each one was longer and more varied than the last, as if whatever was generating them was learning how to say more. I want to be precise about something. I did not know what the responses meant. I do not mean that I couldn't decode the content. I mean that I didn't know if they had content in any sense I could recognize. They might have been information. They might have been a form of speech. They might have been something else entirely, some mode of exchange for which I had no category. What I knew was that they were responses, that there was a relationship between what I sent and what came back, that the pattern of responses changed when I changed what I sent, that something out there at 800,000 kilometers was reacting to me specifically rather than simply emitting background noise. That was enough to keep me at the transmitter. I kept detailed logs. I noted every exchange, every interval, every variance. I noted the way the response length seemed to track with the emotional intensity of the music, slower, quieter songs getting back longer responses, the hard driving stuff getting back something shorter and sharper, that my harmonic analyzer kept flagging as high amplitude. I noted the way pauses between transmissions changed the responses, as if silence was itself a kind of signal, a different kind of information from the songs. I noted everything and I made no conclusions from any of it because I had no framework for conclusions, and the one thing I was determined not to do was impose a human framework on something that was, whatever else it was, not human. This sounds patient and measured. It was not always patient and measured. There were nights when I sat at the console with my log recorder running and talked to whatever was out there the way you talk to someone in another room when you're not sure they can hear you, just to fill the silence, just to feel that the words were going somewhere rather than dissolving into the walls. There were nights when I played the rock station straight into the transmitter and just let it run, no modulation, no structure, just the music going out into the dark, and waited. There were nights when I sat in Marta's chair instead of mine and looked at the porthole and thought about what it meant that something had traveled from where, how far, through what, and had come to rest at 800,000 kilometers from a dead station and decided to listen. The 3rd month of exchanges, on a morning when the instruments were giving me a nominal reading, and the rock station was playing something with a harmonica in it, the harmonic analyzer flagged something new. Not a change in the interference pattern, a new reading, closer. 200 kilometers. I went to the optical scope. I have tried to describe what I saw in 11 different reports filed over the following 2 years. I have failed in all 11. The word ship is wrong. The word vessel is wrong. The word structure is wrong because structure implies something static. The word creature is wrong in a different direction, implying something biological in a way that does not fit. The word entity is closest, not because it is accurate but because it is vague in the right way. It says, "There is something there, and I do not have a word for what it is." There was light, not reflected light generated from inside or from whatever it had instead of inside, a bioluminescence that was not bioluminescence, a light that pulsed in a rhythm I did not immediately recognize and then did. The rhythm of the guitar in the song I had broadcast that first morning. It was playing back the structure of the first transmission, not in sound but in light, not as reproduction but as translation, the same information rendered in a different medium. The shape of it was not fixed. It changed as I watched, not randomly, not in the way that material under stress changes, but purposefully, the way a hand changes shape when it opens and closes around something. It was perhaps 300 meters across at its widest point, which is the length of a large transport ship, but is not a large transport ship, because a large transport ship sits still, and this was never entirely still. The edges of it always moving in the way the edge of a flame moves, constant adjustment. I watched it for a long time without moving. Then I transmitted. I kept the rock station playing in the background, not deliberate strategy, just the fact that I had not turned it off, that it was always playing, and I had learned by then that the background music was part of the signal in a way I didn't fully understand. I broadcast a greeting, for lack of a better word, a sequence I had developed over the preceding months that I used to open transmissions, a specific pattern of tones that had, over time, reliably preceded response. An opening, not a code, the equivalent of clearing your throat before you speak. The entity at 200 kilometers pulsed in response. What followed was 2 hours of exchange at shorter intervals than anything we had previously managed, the signal travel time now measured in fractions of a second, rather than the minutes it had previously taken the responses to arrive from 800,000 kilometers. I transmitted, it pulsed. It pulsed, I transmitted. The harmonic analyzer ran continuously, and I did not look at it because I did not want to take my eyes off the optical scope, where the entity's changing shape caught its own light and threw it back in patterns I found myself trying to memorize. I want to note something that will sound sentimental in a log report, but is true. I was not afraid. I am still not entirely sure why. By any reasonable measure, I should have been terrified. A 64-year-old man alone on a dead station, 2 light towers from the nearest human being, with an unknown entity at 200 kilometers making direct contact. But what I felt instead was something closer to the feeling I used to get in the early years of a new posting, when everything was unfamiliar and every day was a question I didn't know the answer to yet. A kind of attentiveness. The specific alertness of someone who knows that what happens in the next few hours will matter and is determined to be present for all of it. After 2 hours, the entity withdrew. Not fast, gradually, incrementally, pulling back the way you step back to get perspective on something rather than turning and walking away. It returned to its previous position at 800,000 kilometers, and the exchanges resumed at the previous pace, the long intervals, the careful back and forth. I sat in the main bay for the rest of that day and did not transmit. I needed to think. What I concluded after the better part of a day spent thinking was this: whatever was happening, it was not happening on a human schedule or at a human pace. The entity had been out there for months before it made contact. It had made contact slowly over weeks and months, building something before coming closer. It had come closer once for 2 hours and then withdrawn. It was not rushing. It was not escalating. It was doing something that looked, from where I sat, like patience, like the kind of patience you see in something that has enough time to do things properly. I thought about what that meant for the broader situation. The movement command had told tours about. The thousands of entities spreading through the frontier buffer, moving toward the core worlds. If they were all operating on this timescale, this pace, then the movement was not an invasion in any military sense. Invasions are fast. Invasions exploit speed as a force multiplier. This was not fast. This was the movement of something that didn't think in the same units of time that we did, that had covered 600 light years, and was not interested in rushing the last 10. I filed a report, I wrote it carefully, I addressed it to Command. The reply when it came was not from Command, it was from Tors. She had been assigned to my case. That is what they called it, my case. I was 64 years old and I had a case. She was a fast courier pilot, the best they had for the distances involved, and she had been given a sealed orders package and a courier ship with an upgraded tight beam array and the instruction to get to Cordisburgo and assess the situation and report back. She dropped out of transit drive 6 weeks after I sent the report and put her signal on my board before she had finished deceleration, which meant she had been composing her opening transmission in advance. She said, "Station Cordisburgo, this is Courier 77 Lima, Lieutenant Tors commanding. I am instructed to establish contact and assess. Please confirm you are operational and can receive." I transmitted back, "I am operational, I can receive. I have coffee if you want to dock." She docked 30 minutes later. She was younger than I expected and harder looking than her voice had suggested. A woman maybe 30 years old, compact and precise in her movements, with the particular economy of motion that long-haul courier pilots develop when they spend most of their lives in ships with limited space. She came through the airlock with a sealed case under one arm and the expression of someone who had been briefed extensively and was recalibrating against what they were actually seeing. She looked at the main bay, at the transmitter console running its logs, at Marta's chair in the corner, at the rock station playing, at me. She said, "You've been here 3 years." I said 4 now. She sat down at the secondary console, which I had cleared for her without being asked, which she noticed. She opened the sealed case and put her terminal on the console and began to set up the tight beam link that would let Command monitor the situation in real time. Then she told me what she knew. She told it in about 10 minutes, factual and clean, the way people tell difficult things when they are trying not to editorialize. The entities had been detected moving through the frontier buffer for approximately 8 months, beginning with the outermost positions and progressing inward. The rate of movement was slow by military standards but consistent. The spread of entities was estimated at several thousand individuals, if individual was the right word, distributed across a region of space roughly 600 light-years wide and of unknown depth. 3 frontier outposts had gone silent. All communications traffic from the frontier buffer zone had degraded, consistent with the kind of electromagnetic disruption that my instruments had been logging since the interference started. She said, "Command has a fleet positioned at the frontier boundary. They're holding." I said, "For how long?" She said, "As long as they can justify it politically." I said, "And what is the political timeline on that?" She said, "Unclear. There are people who want to engage. There are people who want to wait. The people who want to engage are louder." I understood. I had dealt with military and political organizations for 31 years, and I understood the pressure she was describing. The noise of something unknown and potentially threatening is very loud when you are responsible for 400 billion people, and silence is very hard to defend as a strategy when the noise gets loud enough. I said, "I need to show you something." I showed her the logs, all 9 months of them, from the first interference reading to the entity's visit at 200 kilometers. I walked her through the exchange record, the harmonic analyses, the pattern mapping I had done. She was quiet for all of it, asking occasional precise questions. What was the instrument error tolerance on this reading? How did I determine this shift was responsive rather than coincidental? What was the power output differential between this transmission and this one? The questions of someone with technical training trying to build a rigorous picture. When I was done, she sat with her hands folded on the console and looked at the transmitter log running in real time. She said, "They haven't attacked you." I said, "No." She said, 4 months before making contact. then 9 months of exchanges, then direct approach, 2 hours, then withdrawal. I said, yes. She said, and the 3 outposts that went silent. I said, I have a theory about that. She waited. I said, I think they were studied. The way you study something you don't recognize carefully without disturbing it. Communications arrays are interesting if you're trying to understand how a species communicates. I think something sat down near each of those outposts and examined the equipment as closely as it could without being noticed, and then withdrew. And I think the reason Cordis Burgo was different is that Cordis Burgo answered. Tors looked at me. She said, you think they stopped at the others because the others didn't respond. I said, I think they stopped because there was nothing there to engage with. When they knocked, nobody was home. When they knocked here. She said, you knocked back. I said, I knocked back. She was quiet again for a long moment. Outside the porthole, the star field did what it always did. The rock station played something with a piano line in it, clean and deliberate. She said, Command wants you extracted. I said, no. She looked at me with the expression I had been expecting, not hostility, but the careful assessment of someone who has to decide how hard to push on something they don't have the authority to order. She said, there are 400 billion people in the core worlds. I know that, I said. She said, if you're wrong about this. I said, I've been here 9 months. I'm still alive. 3 outposts went silent and nobody died. They had every opportunity to do damage and they didn't. I understand that's not proof. I understand that what you're telling me is that the people who want to fire the fleet guns have a point because unknown is dangerous. I know that. But I also know that I am the only human being who has had 9 months of direct exchange with whatever is out there. And if there's anything useful in those 9 months, it's this. They're not in a hurry. They're not escalating. They're doing something that looks like communication, done carefully and without assumption. And that is the thing we cannot afford to interrupt. Tors looked at me for a long time. Then she said, what do you need? I told her. Full diagnostic on the long-range transmitter array. It had been showing intermittent anomalies that I suspected were related to the extended operation under constant load. All my storage drives copied, and the copies taken back to command immediately. Every second of exchange data and every log entry and every harmonic analysis. Nothing withheld. The courier's communication suite linked into mine, so command could monitor exchanges in real time. Ration packs, because mine were running low and I had no interest in dying of supply failure while conducting humanity's first contact. And the rock station relay boosted, because the signal had been degrading and I had learned, over 9 months, that the music was not incidental. It was part of the signal environment that the exchanges had developed in, a context that the other side had learned to read, and I could not afford to have it drop out. Tors looked at the list. Then she got up and started the transmitter diagnostic. She stayed 4 days. She worked hard and she didn't complain, and she ate my ration packs without comment, and she spent the evening sitting at the secondary console reading through the exchange logs with the focused attention of someone trying to learn a new language from first principles. On the second evening, she said, the length variation in the responses is not random. I said, I know. She said, it correlates with the harmonic complexity of the transmission. More complex transmissions get back longer responses. I said, yes. She said, so they're not just acknowledging, they're matching. I said, that's what I think. She said, she stopped, looked at the logs, said, that's language behavior. I said, that's what I think. She left on the 4th day with drives full of data and a formal priority request filed to command and the tight beam link running. Before she went through the airlock, she stopped and looked at me the way people look at someone they are not sure they will see again. She said, you know, I think you're right. I said, I know. She said, I also think you're out here alone at 64 years old, and nobody's coming quickly enough if something goes wrong. I said, Tors, something already went right. Everything from here is managing how right it gets. She didn't say anything to that. She went through the airlock. The courier undocked and fired its drive and left, and I was alone again with the transmitter and the rock station and Marta's chair. That night I broadcast the longest transmission I had sent to that point. Not a song, my own voice. I sat at the console and talked for 40 minutes, not expecting to be understood and not performing for anyone, just talking the way you talk when you have been holding something in for too long, and the pressure of it outweighs the absurdity of releasing it to something that probably doesn't parse human speech. I talked about Marta, about what the station had been before decommissioning, the shape of the days when there had been two of us and a full work roster and supply ships on schedule. About 31 years in deep space and what that does to a man's sense of proportion. The way vast distances stop being abstractions after enough time and start being something you feel in your bones. A permanent calibration of how far you are from anything that matters. I talked about being the last person at the back end of nowhere and discovering that the back end of nowhere was, apparently, somewhere after all. The response came back 18 hours later, the longest in the exchange record to that point, 43 minutes of sustained output, layered in a way the harmonic analyzer couldn't fully process. Something nested and complex, and the word I kept circling back to, considered, like a response that had taken time to compose, like something choosing what it wanted to say. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the response playing on loop and tried to understand it, knowing I couldn't, trying anyway. 31 years in deep space teaches you that the attempt matters as much as the outcome. The months after Tors left were different from the months before. Not in the exchanges themselves, which continued at their established pace, broadcast, response, interval, broadcast, but in the sense of time around them. Before Tors, I had been working in isolation in the most complete sense. Not just alone, but without the knowledge that anyone was watching, anyone was receiving, anyone was building anything from what I was doing. After Tors, the tight beam carried traffic from the other direction. Technicians accessing my systems, analysts asking questions in the message queue, scientists requesting clarifications on specific exchange sequences, a general twice, the civilian xenosociologist I had read. The pressure of their attention was strange. I had been doing this work in the purest quiet for 9 months, just me and the transmitter and whatever was at 800,000 kilometers, and now there were hundreds of people watching every exchange in real time, building interpretive frameworks from the data I was generating, and I could feel the weight of their watching even when they weren't transmitting anything back. I could feel the fleet holding at the frontier boundary. I could feel 400 billion people on the other side of a chain that ran. Entities, to me, to Tor's tight beam link, to command, to whoever was making the decisions. I did not let it change how I worked. That was the most important thing. Whatever I had done for 9 months that had produced this result, that had kept the entity at 800,000 kilometers rather than 800 meters, that had produced an exchange record that the analysts were now describing as the most significant data set in human history. I had done it alone and slowly and without the pressure of expectation, and the pressure of expectation was now the main thing I had to manage. I kept the rock station playing. I kept my transmissions at the same pace. I kept the log running with the same language I had always used, careful and factual, and without conclusions I hadn't earned. The entity came closer a second time, 7 weeks after Tors left. Same bearing, same approach pattern, gradual, the kind of deceleration that signals intent as clearly as any language. It stopped at 400 kilometers this time, not 200, and it held there for 12 hours, longer than the first contact. It pulsed through the entire 12 hours, a sustained output that my instruments recorded as the most complex signal I had yet received, varied across a range of frequencies, with structure nested inside structure that the harmonic analyzer flagged 27 times as internally coherent. I transmitted throughout. I did not match the complexity. I didn't have the equipment to match the complexity, and trying to do so would have been like trying to respond to an orchestra with a single guitar. What I did was maintain the rhythm of the exchanges we had established. Transmission, pause, transmission, the beat of a conversation, even when the content of the conversation was beyond my ability to decode. I kept the rock station running. I talked into the log recorder during the pauses, describing what I was seeing, keeping my voice steady not because I felt steady, but because the log was going to command, and I did not want the general who read it to hear a frightened old man. The entity withdrew after 12 hours, same gradual recession, back to 800,000 kilometers. I sat down at the console and filed a report. The third contact came 11 weeks later. This time it came to 8 kilometers. 8 kilometers is the distance between the center of a small city and its outskirts. It is close enough that if I had been outside the station, in a suit, in open space, I could have looked at it with my naked eyes and seen every movement of that changing edge, every pulse of generated light. 8 kilometers, and it held there for 6 hours. And what it did during those 6 hours was the thing that took longest to analyze and was ultimately most important. My instruments during those 6 hours registered the following: sustained electromagnetic output, complex and rhythmic, consistent with the established exchange pattern. Also, a secondary output in a frequency range my instruments were not designed to monitor, which I only detected because I was running a broadband scan that I had added to my routine specifically to catch things my primary instruments might miss. The broadband scan logged the secondary output as sustained, structured, and directed specifically at the station, not at the transmitter, not at any particular instrument, but at the station as a whole, like an ear pressed against a wall. They were listening to the station, not to my transmissions, to the station itself, the hum of the life support systems, the circulation fans, the temperature regulators, the random acoustic noise of equipment that has been running for years and has its own frequencies and its own rhythms. The rock station playing in the main bay, the sounds of a human habitation, reduced to their electromagnetic signatures and apparently worth 6 hours of careful attention. I understood something then that I had been circling for months without landing on it. They were not just listening to what I was sending. They were listening to what I was. The signals I broadcast were interesting, but the background, the constant electromagnetic presence of a station where a human being lived and worked and ate and slept and played rock music late at night when he couldn't sleep, that was what they had been processing all along. The transmissions were conversation. The station was context. I turned the rock station up. I made noise. I walked the corridors more than I needed to. I ran every non-essential system I had been keeping in standby mode, filling the electromagnetic environment of the station with as much information about how a human being lives as I could generate. I made coffee and ate a ration pack and talked to Marta's chair. I put on the recording of Marta reading the Gimmer's Rosa passage. I had recorded it once, years ago, just to have it, and played it through the station speakers. At the end of 6 hours, the entity broadcast a signal 11 minutes long that was unlike anything in the exchange record. My analysts would argue about it for years, and the xenosociologist would write 3 separate papers about it, and none of them would fully agree on what it meant. My own theory, which I wrote in a log entry I never included in any official report, it was an acknowledgement, not of the transmissions of me, of the specific and individual fact of a human being at this station, at these coordinates with his rock station and his coffee and his dead wife's chair. Something vast and old and patient had leaned close and listened and understood something, not everything, probably not even most of it, but something, and was saying, "Yes, I see you. I hear what you are." The movement toward the core world slowed 3 weeks after that contact. I did not know this immediately. The tight beam traffic from command increased significantly in the week after the third contact, and I could read the urgency in the analyst's questions even when they were phrased carefully. When the general came on for his second call, 3 days after the contact, he was quieter than the first time. Something had shifted. He said the rate of movement has decreased significantly. I said yes. He said the fleet analysts believe this is a strategic adjustment, a repositioning. I said I don't think that's what it is. He said, what do you think it is? I said, I think they heard something they hadn't heard before. I think they needed to process it. He was quiet for a moment. He said, the 3 silent outposts are not silent anymore. I said, tell me. He said, Redborough Station contacted us 6 days ago. Intact, crew safe, communications restored. The mining operation at Sector 7 North contacted us yesterday. The research post at the junction contacted us this morning. All intact. No casualties. I said nothing. He said, the disruption to their communications arrays lasted between 40 and 90 days at each site. Then the arrays were restored. The crews described the experience as he paused, and I could hear him checking a document as a sustained period of electromagnetic interference, during which their equipment became inoperable, followed by a period of apparent study of the equipment, followed by restoration. Like library books, I said. He said, what? I said, they pick them up and read them and put them back. The general was quiet for a while. Then he said, the analysts want to brief you formally on the full intelligence picture. I said, send it through the tight beam queue. I'll read it when I have time. He said, the diplomatic corps wants to establish a formal protocol for your exchanges. I said, tell them I'll read their protocol and I'll use what's useful and I'll discard what isn't. He said, Osorio, with respect, you are one man. I said, yes, and the 400 billion people you're responsible for are still alive, so let me keep doing what I'm doing. He said nothing for a long time. Then, what do you need? The same question Tors had asked. I told him the same kind of things: equipment upgrades, ration resupply, technical support through the tight beam link. I asked for the xenosociologist to be given direct access to the exchange log in real time so I could query her analysis as I worked. He agreed to all of it. He signed off. 6 weeks later, the movement stopped. Stopped entirely. The entities distributed through the frontier buffer settled into fixed positions and stayed there. Not withdrawn, not moving away from human space, simply still. The way something sits still when it is thinking. The exchanges continued. At Cordisburgo and gradually at the 3 restored outposts, and eventually at 11 other frontier stations that the entities had apparently decided were worth approaching. All of them following a pattern similar to mine, beginning with interference, progressing to close contact, conducted by whatever human crew happened to be there when it started. Not always old men, not always widowers. A young engineering team at a water processing relay, a pair of surveyors who had been waiting out a mission extension, a senior station keeper who had been about to retire. All of them, in their own ways, doing what I had done, answering, staying at the console and transmitting back when something out there transmitted in. The xenosociologist wrote me a long message once, near the end of the first year. She was trying to understand, she said, why the contact at Cordisburgo had preceded all the others by so many months. Was it the position of the station, the specific frequency of the rock station, some property of the equipment that my instruments were producing that had been more legible to the entities than the emissions from other stations? I wrote back, I think it was because nobody left. She asked me to elaborate. I wrote, the other stations went dark when they were decommissioned. The crews were extracted. The transmitters were put in standby mode. The life support ran on minimum power and the electromagnetic signature of the station contracted to almost nothing. A station in standby is not the same as a station with someone in it. It doesn't sound the same. It doesn't move the same way through the electromagnetic environment. I think they were looking for signs of habitation before they decided to make contact, and Cordis Burgo was the one that was still breathing. She sat with that for a while. Then she wrote, "That implies a sophistication of detection we hadn't credited them with." I wrote, "They crossed 600 light years to look at us. How sophisticated did we expect them to be?" She didn't have an answer for that. She went back to her analysis. The formal diplomatic initiative launched 14 months after Tor's first visit. I was not part of it in any direct operational sense. I was 65 by then, and the diplomatic corps had younger people with better training and better equipment, and the exchanges had progressed far enough that they had something to work with. I was consulted. My logs were the foundational document. The exchange patterns I had developed over those first months became the basis for the formal contact protocol, which was called, officially, the Cordis Burgo Exchange Protocol, which I thought was a reasonable name for something that had started with one old man and a rock station. I stayed on the station. Nobody asked me to leave this time either, but for different reasons. The diplomatic corps sends people occasionally. Young analysts, junior scientists, technicians who need hands-on calibration time with the exchange equipment. They come through the airlock with the look of people arriving somewhere they have heard about and are trying to reconcile with the actual place, which is a metal corridor with red dust on the solar panel indicators, and a rock station playing in the main bay and an old man at a console who doesn't look particularly historic. I give them coffee. I answer their questions. I show them the log archive. After a few days they settle in, and I see them listening to the exchanges the way I listened in the beginning, with the specific focused attention of someone who has accepted that they cannot yet decode what they are hearing, but refuses to stop trying. That is the right instinct. That is, I think, the only instinct that ever gets you anywhere with something that old and that patient. The xenosociologist came in person, eventually. She was younger than I expected people who write that extensively always read as older, and she sat in the main bay for 2 days without saying much, just reading the logs and listening to the exchanges and watching the instruments. On the 3rd day she said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "For what?" She said, "For all the papers I wrote in the first year that described the early exchanges as statistically ambiguous, as potentially coincidental pattern matching. I was wrong. I knew I was wrong when I wrote it, but I wrote it anyway because the alternative was saying that contact had occurred and had been conducted successfully by one retired relay keeper with a shortwave transmitter and no formal xenolinguistics training, and that was professionally uncomfortable. I said, "Was it professionally comfortable to be wrong in print?" She laughed. First time I had heard her laugh, she said, "No, it was not." She stayed a month. She was good company, the kind of company that doesn't require constant conversation and knows when to leave a man to his work. When she left, she shook my hand at the airlock and said, "You know they'll name something after you." I said, "They already named something after the station." She said, "I mean after you. A category, a methodology, something." I said, "I'd rather they use it than name it." She said, both happens." She left. I went back to the transmitter. There is a new presence in the sky. Different bearing, 11 degrees off stellar south, slightly above the ecliptic, a different vector from the original. Different spectral signature. The interference pattern is not identical to the first, but it has the same quality, the same deliberateness I had learned to recognize in those early months. My instruments picked it up 6 weeks ago. The mass reading resolved after 4 days of observation. Something at approximately 600,000 kilometers settled into position, waiting. It arrived from the direction of the 600 light-year spread, from beyond the frontier, from whatever unmapped territory lies out past the edge of what we have explored and charted and named. Which means it came from deeper in, not from the same region as the first entities. Which means whatever word passed between them about this station, about what was found here, traveled a distance I can't fully comprehend, and something new heard it and came to see. Something new. Something that had never encountered a human being before. Something that came out of the deep dark to the coordinates it had been given and found a decommissioned relay station with a shortwave transmitter and a man at the console. I notified command. I notified the xenosociologist. I notified Tors, who is running a longer route now but still has my tight beam frequency in her navigation computer. I filed the routine log entry, gave it a formal incident number, described the readings in the careful measured language that 3 years of practice had made automatic. Then I tuned the transmitter. I ran the standard opening sequence, the pattern I had developed over those first months, refined now into something cleaner and more deliberate, the equivalent of a clear, calm voice saying, "I am here. I am listening. What you say to me will be heard." I broadcast it at full power on the bearing they gave me, and then I sat for a moment with my hand on the transmitter key, the way you sit for a moment before saying something that matters. Then I broadcast Marta's favorite song. The one with the guitar solo that argues with the universe, that loses and argues again and arrives somewhere true. Full power, tight beam, aimed at the dark. Then I sat down with my coffee, in my chair, next to Marta's empty chair, and I waited for them to answer. They will answer, I know that now. Patience on one side calls to patience on the other. Something vast and old and full of time heard a small signal from a dead station at the back end of nowhere and leaned in to listen and found a human being still at his post. Whatever they concluded from that, it traveled. Word moves, even across distances I cannot measure, even through the dark between the dark. Something out there was told. Go to those coordinates, there is something there worth hearing. Here I am. I think about the general sometimes, the one who wanted to fire the fleet guns. I don't blame him. I have spent enough time in uniform to understand the weight of 400 billion people pressing down on every decision, the way that weight makes cautious men reckless and patient men hasty. He was doing what he had been trained to do. Identify the threat, assess the options, prepare a response. Nothing in his training had prepared him for a response that consisted of one old man and a rock station and patience. That is not a failure of his training. That is simply a gap between what we were ready for and what arrived. I think about what it means that the gap was filled by accident, by the fact that a decommissioned station had a stubborn occupant who hadn't been formally extracted yet. The diplomatic corps calls it the Cordisburgo Protocol now, as if it were designed. It was not designed. It was improvised daily by a man who had run out of other things to do and refused to let silence be his final answer. That is a human thing, that stubborn refusal to let the silence stand, to transmit into the dark even when you have no evidence the dark is listening, to play a song for something you cannot see because the alternative is not playing the song and the song wants to be played and you are still here, and the transmitter still works and the dark is very large but it is not, you have learned, entirely empty. One man, one dead station. One transmitter and a rock station, and 31 years of deep space stubbornness that nobody had bothered to reassign. I did not save humanity. I did not win anything. I did not find a weapon or crack a code or discover the secret weakness of something incomprehensibly large and old. I did what anybody with sense would have done, who had nothing left to lose and a transmitter still running, and a song he wanted someone to hear. I stayed, I answered, the rest followed from there. Marta would have said, obviously, what else were you going to do? She was right, she was almost always right.